Start recording now. Okay. Right, everybody. You're all very welcome to this, the third Dante dialogue of our spring series, and a very special welcome to our international friends and colleagues. It's always a great pleasure to have you here with us for these events. Now, today's dialogue marks, I suppose, a turn in our series as we put our focus onto archives and to libraries, and we kind of seek to explore this very rich topic of Dante holdings. And today's dialogue is very much the brainchild of our CDSI member and friend, Dr. Federica Coluzzi. Not only has Federica been a kind of a tireless member of our team here in ECC, this year she moved on to pastures new and is currently a Leverhulme Fellow at the University of Warwick. But she is a person of unbounded energy and has kept, in fact, she's deepened her relationship with UCC despite her from these shores. But she, so when we were coming up with ideas for the series, Federica immediately expressed a need to interrogate the theme of collecting Dante. And with this, with this in mind, she set out to assemble a truly stellar group of interlocutors. So, therefore, today, thanks to Federica, we are in the most fortunate position to welcome Julianne Simpson, Christian Dupont, and Corinna Lonergan. Julianne Simpson is Research Engagement Manager based at the John Rylands Library in Manchester. She manages the rare book collections with particular responsibility for foreign language, literature, and East Asian printed collections, incunabula, history of science, technology, and medicine, and is subject liaison for history, both medieval and early modern, and also Italian studies. She's previously worked at the University of Oxford, Melbourne, and the Wellcome Library in London. Christian Dupont has served as Burns Librarian and Associate University Librarian for Special Collections at Boston College since 2014, and as Secretary and Librarian for the Dante Society of America for as many years. He began his career as a rare books and manuscript curator at the University of Notre Dame, where he also earned a doctorate in theology. And among his publications in various disciplines are studies of the formation of major American Dante collections and associated figures. Recent and forthcoming essays explore early women readers of Dante in New England, the phenomenology of consciousness in the Commedia, and the illustration history of illustrations of Canto Inferno, Canto 33. And last but not least, Professor Corinna Lonergan is Fellow Emerita at Trinity College Dublin, where she led the Department of Italian for many decades. She also served as president of AIPI, the Associazione Internazionale Professori di Italiano, for a number of years, and indeed she has been indefatigable, I think, in her work at promoting the academic discipline of Italian, both nationally and internationally. Her research interests include Dante and the Trecento, Renaissance literature with a particular focus on Lorenzo de' Medici. She's published extensively on many medieval and Renaissance writers, as well as on that very rich seam of dialogue between these and Irish writers, and I think most especially Samuel Beckett. Of her publications, I think we should mention Yeats and Castiglione, Poet and Courtier from 1965, Lorenzo de' Medici, Selected Writings, 1995, which also includes her wonderful translation of the Rappresentazioni di San Giovanni e Paolo, and more recently, Overture to the Opera, Italian Pastoral Drama, and the Renaissance Poliziano's Orfeo, Tasso's Aminta, which she did with the late Peter Brand. So, what do we mean exactly when we say Dante dialogue? Well, as I've said in previous, as I've said in previous dialogues, let me put it to you this way. Imagine, if you will, a group of friends gathered together in a cozy, warm Irish pub, and there they hit upon a topic, and each speaks passionately about their particular take on that topic, holding their ground, but allowing the dialogue to flourish. That is the hope that we have for this series. And also I should add that we genuinely hope that you, the audience, will contribute to the discussion at the end. And with this in mind, can I ask everybody now who isn't a speaker to make sure that their microphones are turned off, and then you can turn them back on for what discussion will follow later on. So I'm going to pass over to Federica now. Federica, a te la parola.
Thank you, Dara, for your kind words of presentation. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating today's event in our dialogue series and to welcome so many friends and colleagues this evening. Well, it is fair to say that in the life of a researcher, the moment where we finally meet the works we've been working on in flesh and blood, or shall we say ink and paper, is one of the most exciting aspects of the job. If we think about it, the whole process resembles the preparation for a romantic date of sorts. So we make our booking at a special collection reading room, we put on our best and warmest jumper, we bring a well-sharpened pencil and patiently wait for the collection assistant to ask us, which one would you like to start from? We choose, return to our seat and start sifting through the pages. And that one is a moment of continuously renewed wonder, at least to me, for the things that strikes our sight at first, for the minuscule handwriting and reading traces that we spot all of a sudden, for the uncut pages that are yet to be opened after decades, if not centuries, after the book was first brought into the collection. And in the case of Dante studies, the corpus ranges from 13th century illuminated manuscripts to early printed editions and incunabula, illustrated and commented modern editions, along with archival materials, so concerns relating to papers, notes, and other formats of cultural significance. The unique and distinctive collections held by research libraries have long been recognized as cultural assets by academic institutions, thanks to their strong research and educational potential. The digitization and outreach activities have opened up special collections, turning them from treasure rooms with very limited access to spaces open to diverse audience groups, breeding grounds for interdisciplinary collaboration and conversation in research, teaching, and learning. So from the Laurentiana and the Vaticana to the John Rylands, the Bodleian, the Fisk and the Zam collection, special collections are essential, very essential to the textual, the philological, the editorial, and the book historical study of Dante and his works. They are crucial to scholarship because they preserve the bibliographical and material history of the formation, reception, and dissemination of Dante knowledge worldwide. And furthermore, and this year most conspicuously, I must say, libraries and archives have been proactively involved in instructional outreach through the organization of digital and physical, unfortunately for this year is a bit strange to say, but exhibits, collection encounters, public lecture series, and much more. So the reasons why I really wanted one of these dialogues to focus on collecting Dante is because even though the scholarly and heritage value of special collections is undisputed, little is known about how these very collections, these very Dante collections, came to be in the first place, of the lives and intentions of those men and women collectors who developed them through the years with the help of librarians and Dante specialists. And also similarly overlooked is the fact that these very collections are not static entities, but they are in constant development thanks to donations as well as very carefully planned acquisitions. So today's dialogue brings together the experiences of academic researchers and special collections professionals to discuss the issues and challenges of collecting Dante in Britain, Ireland, and North America from a transhistorical perspective. So for those of you who are new to our Dante dialogues, I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but I'm repeating Dara's words a little bit here, but I just want to say that the aim of this series is to celebrate the Centenario Dantesco with a non-scholarly, non-specialist, but wide-ranging conversations among what emerges to be a very diverse community of Dante readers, collectors, scholars, and enthusiasts. And for those of you who took part, who are taking part, who have taken part to our previous events, both of which were book launches, I just want to point out that today will also feature flash presentations from our 3 guests, which will be followed up by short follow-up questions, and then we will open the floor for the Q&A. So as Dara said, we really welcome your intervention into this, because it's not a conference per se, but we want to preserve that informal conversational dialoguing voice throughout the event. So without further ado, I shall leave the floor to Julianne Simpson from the John Rylands Library in Manchester. So thank you, Julianne.
Okay, thank you. So I've got a few images to show you, just to give you some context to the Dante collection at the John Rylands Library in Manchester. So this is an image of the main reading room in the Rylands Library. It's a very impressive neo-Gothic building, which opened to the public in 1900. And you can see at the far end of this space, there's a stained glass window. This is a bit closer up. This is what we call the arts window, which is in counterpoint to what was behind us in the perspective we saw in the previous image of the theology window, where the theology window shows various Old Testament prophets and theologians right through to the 19th century. In the arts window, we have a mixture of ancient philosophers, musicians, artists, and literary figures. And so here we have Dante. You can see my mouse moving around, can't you? So he's just here, the third from the right at the bottom. And so Dante is memorialized in the building as well as being part of the collection itself. So what was it about Dante in particular? This is the man that the library is named after, John Rylands. He made his fortune in Manchester from the cotton industry. And when he died in 1888, he left this, about £2.5 million, in fact, to his third wife, Enriqueta. And it was Enriqueta, in fact, who was responsible for the establishment of the library and the building of its collections. But between the two of them, they were both very interested and passionate about all things Italian as well. They spent quite a bit of time there. They set up an orphanage in Rome, and in 1880 John was presented with the Order of the Crown in response to his charitable works and support of work with orphans in the city. So they had this quite close connection, and this shines through in the collection and in Enriqueta's focus on gathering together the books that became part of that foundation collection for the Rylands Library. Some of it is slightly by chance that it's appeared. Other acquisitions were much more deliberate. This is the library, as it says, it opened to the public in 1900, so it took about 10 years to build, and Enriqueta was very closely involved in the design and the architecture of the library. So those, the Dante that we see in the window and the other decoration and the statues within the building were all very much part of her vision for the architecture and design of the library. So most particularly for the printed collections at the Rylands was Enriqueta's acquisition of the Spencer Library in 1892. And this was purchased from the 5th Earl Spencer, but was actually put together mostly by his grandfather, who we see here, George John, the 2nd Earl Spencer, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And Spencer's focus was really on gathering together the landmarks of early printing, early editions. And through that, we have in the collection really quite an astounding amount of early printed editions of Dante. So of the 15 that were published before 1500, we have copies of 14 of those, including the 3 of the first printed editions that appeared in 1472. And on the right, the monumental Florentine edition with new commentary by Cristoforo Landino, published in 1481. Of which there's also an event on Tuesday organised by UCL in London, where we're going to quite ambitiously show, I think, about more than 10 copies from, or at least from 10 different libraries. So if you're interested in that, do have a look and come along next Tuesday afternoon. Additionally to that, Mrs. Rylands made individual acquisitions. So this is it's not really a title page as such, it's a manuscript produced in 1902. with illustrations, as you see on the title, by Attilio Razzolini. And this manuscript was then used to produce lithographic printed copies, which are still available for sale. But this is the original manuscript that was produced as part of that enterprise. So that came to the library, acquired by Mrs. Rylands. And also one of the other areas that she particularly started to collect in before the library opened from the mid-1890s onwards was the burgeoning private press movement in England at the time. So she began to collect books from the Kelmscott Press, first of all, from William Morris. But the example here is the Dante, the Divine Comedy edition, sorry, from the Ashendene Press, the quarto editions published from 1902 to 1905, and then additionally the complete works in folio, just called the Ashendene Dante, which was produced in 1909. And these we have copies of, the very limited copies that were printed on vellum. So not just the standard run of the paper copies, but actually these luxury editions on vellum. This is not actually our copy. I don't have any images of it. We haven't taken any pictures of it. This is Emery Walker's copy, which is at the Cheltenham Museum and Gallery, standing in for our copy. Then in 1906, Mrs. Rylands made really her most significant Dante-related acquisition, and this was 6,000 volumes purchased from the Count Giuseppe Lando Passerini, who was librarian of the Lorenziana in Florence, and also left his own Dante library to Arezzo, to his hometown in Arezzo. And so this was really the core of what we have now of our Dante collection. So as well as the original editions, printed editions from the 15th and 16th century, also a great deal of secondary literature, especially from the 19th century and into the early 20th century. So really the basis of a very strong and significant collection. In addition to that, we continue to acquire landmark Dante editions. This, although again, not always directly. So this is an example of the Inferno edition, illustrated and produced by the artist Tom Phillips in 1983. But this was acquired as part of a collection of designer book bindings. So the binding that you see was instigated, was created by designer bookbinder James Brockman. And just lastly, here I am next to one of our more recent acquisitions, a very substantial 3-volume edition of the Divine Comedy, which was, I think, to remember when it was commissioned, I think they started work in 1911, actually in advance of the 1921 centenary. And the artist, I knew I was going to forget his first name. I didn't make it. Amos, thank you, Nazzini, and not completed until 1932. So a very long labour of love. And this is how it arrived to us in our offsite store in a packing crate. Now, fortunately, in a much better home within the library itself. But again, I don't have a picture of it on the shelves now. This was when it was unpacked in 2018 when it arrived. And there's just a few examples of some of the illustrations to that work. So while we don't continue to collect exhaustively of all modern editions, we do continue to add selectively to our collection, particularly significant editions, and in this example, historical editions that we don't already have. So we want to continue to build on Mrs. Ryland's foundation and the core of that Dante collection, and we hope in the future to continue to build our collections. So I'll stop stop there. So hopefully that's about right to give you enough background for the Rylands collections. And I'll hand back to Federica.
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you, Julianne. I must say, I must confess to everybody that I was one of the lucky researchers to actually see and handle the beautiful private press editions of that belong to Enriqueta Rylands as well, and they're truly wonderful items to study that deserves to be studied more. I have a couple of questions that I'm sure I've already asked you over the years. We worked together when I was in Manchester. It was an absolute privilege. But my question would be, what it means to collect Dante today? Yes, you're saying that you're not collecting acquiring exhaustively, but you're selecting the items that you are acquiring for the Rylands, for the Rylands Dante collection. So here I'm thinking about, how do we continue building heritage? How do we preserve the identity, the unique identity of the Rylands Dante collection in present day?
Well, I think specifically for us, and we have to be selective. Now we don't necessarily have the funds that Mrs. Rylands had available to her in the late 19th century, but our focus tends to be on an intersection with a couple of different collecting interests in the library, and that is the private press examples and the Dante. So I guess it's still a bit subjective, and it does and all collecting in libraries, I think, is quite subjective. I can see that from the way that the focus of the library's collecting changes depending on who's in charge as well, and who's responsible. But my predecessors may have had different leaned in different directions. It also depends quite a bit on, for us now, on the activities within the university. So in order to justify our the budget that we have for acquisitions, it very much has to be linked quite closely to research and teaching activity at Manchester, which is why I was having academics like Steve really helps to bolster that, having a strong Italian studies department.
Exactly, like so to build the collection, also considering the research and the teaching interest and needs, how, and this is something that perhaps we can discuss more with the Q&A, but considering how we can bring into the classroom, the collection to the classroom, how we can establish a connection between the students, undergraduates, postgraduates, students and researchers with the collection and with the different artifacts that the collection holds. I am thinking about also the fact that one of the strengths of the Rylands is also the 19th century collections, which tells us a lot about the way in which Dante studies developed in Britain very recently, so the past century and a half, let's say. And it's very, very interesting. Also, perhaps later on we could discuss a little bit more also digital projects as well, but we'll open the floor and we'll discuss with Christian and Corinna. Thank you very much, Julianne. It was absolutely interesting. And so Corinna, Professor Lonergan will discuss, will take us across the sea in Ireland to discuss how like Dante collections are built in Ireland, and what has been her experience as a researcher within special collections. Corinna?
And unmute myself.
Yes.
Here I am. Right, share. Here I go, and I want to. Are you, yes, you are seeing, sorry, are you seeing and hearing me, Federica? Yes,
Yes.
is that all right? Good. Well, a bit like Julianne, I want to give you some context. This is the library. This is where I have worked for nearly 60 years on the books I'm going to talk about. And I'm really going to present this very much as a user of this library. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the absolutely wonderful help I've had in recent weeks from the persons I have listed there, because it has not been possible in COVID conditions, you know, to go back to these books, which I would have used up to the last exhibition I worked on, which was in 2019 for a summer school, a Dante summer school. So I'm very grateful to them for the pictures that I have. And that is the building where I work and they work, the librarians, and this is the building. And this building actually goes back to Thomasburg to 1712. We call it the Old Library. Now, the college itself was founded in 1592 by the first Queen Elizabeth. And we know that by 1601, there were some 30 books and 10 manuscripts in the library. But the building then comes into being in 1732, and I will show you quickly another picture of it. And then this, which is a James Moulton watercolor from 1794. Now, that is what it looked like for the first 100+ years of its life. And then this is what we would all be familiar with, what we call the long room, where the present wooden barrel vault replaced the flat plaster ceiling in 1859. And I'm just going to share a little detail to give you a sense of what working with these books was like. When I first went to Trinity, there was no electricity in that building and there was no electricity in that room. And what we did was we used bicycle lamps, which were along the wall. This is to give you an idea. You use the bicycle lamp, you went up the ladder and you took your own book. We didn't have, at the time, anyone who went and did that for you. And I think you've seen a bit what the ladders were like. Could you imagine that happening nowadays? Still, when I was young, I obviously had no trouble with it. Now, I want to get straight to a prized possession. And this is first edition of the comedy. It is the 1472, yes, 1472 Foligno, and it came to us in a donation from Quinn, the Quinn collection. And here is another image of the first page. And you see, it's very simply the Commedia di Dante Alighieri di Fiorenza. And it is beautifully illustrated in that first page. And then the second, Purgatorio, is called a seconda parte. And you see there is a P missing for percorrer, because that is slightly penciled in, and obviously some illustrated initial was to be done, which never happened. And then, oh dear, sorry, something has gone wrong. Sorry, I just try to get to this one only. Yeah, here we go, right again. Right, and this is the third, and by the time it comes to Paradiso, it's actually called a cantica, and you see that the L of La Gloria is missing. And then I show you the colophon, where you see the dating at the bottom, nel 1407 nel quarto mese a di 5 e 6, of the quarto mese being Aprile. So we are actually celebrating this in the right month. And what I love is that the work is called by the printer here, un'opera gentile. I think gentile is quite appropriate for Dante. Now, you might say, you know, what is so very important apart from the rarity, etc. It's lovely to be able to tell students, and I have taught Dante for nearly 60 years in the department. It's lovely to tell students that they can come and see this in the library, indeed take them over to see it, and make them realize how far back and real the work is. It's not the modern edition which they are using, but it just goes back much more. Now, in the binding is just Dante Commedia. We don't have, that's not the original binding. What I can tell you about it, which is, well, I think very interesting, is what it cost. It cost £34, 2 and 6pence, and it was bought in 1789 by Quinn at one of them. He was a college graduate, he was an alumnus, and he was a wonderful collector. And in fact, it is to Quinn again that we owe the next work I want to show you. I'm skipping, sorry. This is the Jesi Dante, the Liber Dantes, and this is the colophon from Jesi. I'm showing it to you because a lot of people seem to think that the Jesi is first, but as you will see, it's later than ours. The difference between them is that the Trinity one is printed by a German printer, whereas the one in Jesi is printed by an Italian printer. So it's the first of Italian printings in the full sense of the word. Now, I am then passing over Landini. We have the Landino, we don't have the Florentine one. We have Venice 1491. But of greater interest, I think, is this Aldus. It's of greater interest, I think, in part because it's not called Dante as was at the time, but not even Liber Dantes. It's quite simply called Le Terze Rime di Dante. And that apparently was the title wanted by Pietro Bembo. And it's the first portable commedia because it's in octavo, and it's also in italics. It may be a first italics of Aldus, and it also has, for what again may be the first time, the symbol of the anchor, which then was to become associated with the Aldine press. Now, Quinn paid £3, 8 and 3pence for this one, and it was very possibly bought in 1781, it's 1789, and it was at the Crevenna auction, where a very famous one, where he was presented with the auctioneer's gavel for having paid the highest price of any book at that particular sale. So a very splendid book, as I can show you, Purgatorio, and then the Paradiso, and then I'm going to move to this, which is not famous, but I think it's intriguing to me. It's for something of interest, which I'll mention to you now. This is a Dante commentary by Daniello. Now, this and the Vellutello were the only two full commentaries of the Cinquecento, and this was never reprinted. Its date is 1568. And why I show it to you is because it has in the board of the cover, it's got this handwritten statement by Dr. Carlyle, as he signs himself. He is the younger brother of the more famous Thomas. And as you see, I have put out, typed up what he's writing. And he considers it the best commentary of the Cinquecento. And he says it is to the great discredit of the Italians that it was never again reprinted. He himself must have used this, and 1849 was also the date of publication of his prose translation of Inferno, which then had a second edition in 1867. And what intrigued me was, why was it not reprinted? Now, I could tell you a lot more, but maybe later if it's of interest, but I'm associating it because this was an edition promoted by John Milton. I'm associating it actually with Counter-Reformation, and indeed Lino Pertile has written about this, and very likely it was simply suppressed, or certainly no encouragement to be printing it again. Now, I'm going to move to something very special, which is very well known and much illustrated. And this is, this is our Vellutello. And now, I pass on, show you. Yeah, this is your Dante con l'esposizioni di Cristoforo Landino, di Alessandro Vellutello, and all edited by Francesco Sansovino Fiorentino. this is the 1578 edition. We have the earlier one without illustrations, but this is the 1578. And there is your first Della Commedia di Dante Alighieri, your first canto, and then some illustrations from Inferno, and then our Purgatorio, the second cantica, and then the Paradiso. And this, I know it's often reproduced and so on, but it is really very special. And it comes to us, sorry, I want to go back to the colophon, so you see that. And it is, it comes to us from the Fagel collection. And I have a lot of information on the Fagel collection, which will be available on the chat. Dara has kindly said he will put it up for me. And it's, I will tell you more about Fagel quickly as I pass on. And this is possibly linked to the provenance. And I want to show you now a very unusual book, but very, very splendidly produced. And this is the comedy, and here it is. Now, in where you're seeing the opening of the volume. This was done for the Empress of the Emperor of all Russia, the daughter of Peter the Great. And it has very splendid illustrations. And on every illustration, you have the name, both of the engraver, the scultore, and the draftsman. And they're different throughout, they're different. And so I think also of interest to anyone working on the range of artists that were available at the time in Venice. And it's really very, very splendidly produced. It has got curious little notes, lots of them actually, like igualmente being explained as egualmente, but I give you this because the last line of the Commedia is very simply summed up as il sommo Iddio. That's the meaning, full stop, no more to be argued. And this is a very puny Dante that is contained in that edition, and it's tratto da un antico originale che trovasi nella Toscana, and I think it would have been better if they had left it in the Toscana. It's no credit to Dante. Now, this is a page from the Fagel collection, and really this was acquired in 1802, and it was made possible by the Erasmus Smith Fund and bought before it went to auction. Now, this was extremely important because it added to the CCD collection some 40%, but also broadened the scope. It brought in literature, it brought in foreign languages. The Copyright Act came in 1801, and that brought to the college library what was material that was published in the British Isles. And that, of course, has been a fantastic support, but we were lacking the continental element of the foreign language. And I should say that most importantly, in 1776, the Italian department was founded in the college. It was the earliest in these islands with French, German, and Spanish. And people like Evasio Radice, who was its professor of Italian, will have wanted Italian books. And really a great input came, as you see from this page of the catalogue of the Fagel collection. And the project manager, it's all being digitized now, also has said to me that 400 books on Italian history came with it. So not just literature. There you have Ariosto, Boccaccio, Bembo, Dante, Goldoni, Machiavelli, tutte le opere, and so it goes to Tasso. And also through Fagel, we have a monarchy, which goes back to 1606. And it is a tract with some others of historical and theological importance, which are from 1062 to 1566. So it's no surprise to me, given that background, but also bearing in mind that we are talking the end of the 18th century and beginning of 19th. That was the time of Georgian Dublin. It is the time of Georgian architecture, of Lord Charlemont, the great Italophile. So it doesn't surprise me, and with Italian taught in the college, that it should be an alumnus, that it should be a graduate. And I thank Dara for this slide, that it should be a graduate, Henry Boyd, who gave us in 1802 the first full translation of Dante's Commedia, all three cantiche, and we have that from Boyd. He was obviously good at versifying, because he twice won the Poetry Prize as an undergraduate in successive years, and that is done in English verse. And then with Boyd comes immediately afterwards the translation by Henry Francis Carey. That was in 1814, and I will try briefly to say a little bit about about the 19th century that Federica has already mentioned. We have two very wonderful works from that period. One we owe to Lord Vernon, who donated it to the college, and that is the printing of the four texts, the first facsimile of the first four editions, the three 1472 and the Naples 1474, were all brought together in an edition where the four appear in different, the four squares of the page. And then we also have the 1862 Berlin German scholar Karl Witt edition of the four manuscripts, the four earliest manuscripts of the Commedia. So these were milestones in trying to establish a definitive text, which goes on until our own day. Just going to mention very briefly, the number of translations in the 19th century was quite extraordinary. And I want to just begin, I'm taking two dates. This is not the earliest translation, but 1842, Charles Hindley. It appealed to me because he describes his translation simply as plain. That's all, plain, in 1842. Then go to Longfellow in 1867. And I have counted, perhaps not all fully, but I have counted 12 translations of the comedy in that period of 25 years. That's quite extraordinary. Of the full comedy, variously described in the terza rima of the original, in ternary rhyme, into blank verse, in a literal prose translation, and one just says into English. Now, of all of this, and the century has many, it's got Charles Lyell early in the century, who translates poems from the Vita Nuova and the Convito, and actually gives you a dual language publication. But of all, I'm just singling out one, and she stood out because she was the only woman. Mrs. Ramsay, she wasn't even credited with any initials, just Mrs. Ramsay, London, 1862-3. And I want to give you her opening of Canto 14, which I loved. Her opening of the Commedia is actually very accurate. She begins, because from the true path I went astray. And then this is the opening of Canto 14, that Carità del natio loco, which she just gets, the love I bore, my native place prevailed. I like her translation, I really do. Now, I'm going to jump ahead hugely because I'm sure I'm going over my time. This is a beautiful Vita Nuova, beautiful binding, lovely silk. And this is, the translation is by Dante Gabriele Rossetti, who was well dead when this comes out. This is illustrated by Evelyn Paul, and it comes out in St. Albans in 1915. And this is to give you some idea of the illustration and then the final cover. And then, because the college is trying to keep up special Dante editions, not just our Dante collection, which is very good for working purposes. I've been doing this work for nearly 60 years and regularly order, and the library generously keeps providing what we need. But occasionally we have to splash out. And what we have done is acquired a copy of the illustrations of the Commedia by Monica Beisner. And these are her 3 volumes, and called very simply Comedy. And then the 3 on the spine, we have just the word comedy. And it's the Hollander translation. and it's illustrated by Monica Beisner. They're really just wonderful. And I will just show you very quickly. I particularly find this perceptive because this is the entry to hell at the beginning of Canto 3, but there is a hint of Canto 2 there because Dante is with Viltate. He's had to be shaken out of it and brought ahead. And of course, the Ignavi, who are what Dante would be if he had not taken up the challenge and followed Virgil. And then this is just beautiful. Our move to purgatory, I think it's lovely. Can't be too far from me now at this stage of life. And then this is lovely, the last one of the Paradiso. And at the moment, there is an itinerant exhibition. It's in Belgrade, and it has work of Monica Beisner, and it will eventually reach, I think, London in January of 22. Its Italian institutes will be moving it around. And then Monica's own book on the work of her life, but with a great chapter on her work on Dante, is coming out in September. So apologies if I've gone over time. Really tried to give you a sense of the books that are working books, or that's how I have been, because I'm a user of these. So thank you very much, Federica. And I will now stop my share and we go back to...
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Corinna. Thanks so much for showing us the breadth and wealth of the Trinity College collection. It's certainly fascinating, the range of texts and editions that you've covered. I am particularly interested in the way you pointed our attention to the paratextual elements of these editions, to the way in which, and I think this speaks of the importance of, and here I'm bridging with what we were talking about before, of bringing students into the special correction room, also because it's a way entering in contact with the editions allows students also to recenter the attention on elements that are traditionally considered marginal. They are, like, by definition called, like, defined as paratext, but are important, are central to the life of the book, to understanding the actual life of the book, of the Commedia in its manifold transformations, no, through print, from manuscript through print to even digital edition. So like your input in terms of user experience is central. I'm wondering whether you have had over the years direct experience with this with students, whether you had anything that you truly like recognize to be central to their experience of Dante, working with these editions.
It's really been more of the reality of it, that he exists, and that when we now say 700 years, which to anybody is, you know, longer than we can possibly imagine, at the same time to say, look, 1472, here we begin. And also then the richness, I think, well, this is because we have a Center for Literary Translation, and I am myself a translator of poetry. And so this wealth of translation that one has is really quite extraordinary. How this text is a challenge. And, you know, then if you move on, there's more and more. But when I just thought in those 25 years, my goodness, a dozen at least of translations of the Commedia, and that they were published and sold, obviously. And I think actually, it was you, Federica, who told me that Mrs. Ramsey sold very well, and that it went into, you know, into several editions. I think.
Do you mean Claudia Ramsey translation of the?
Yeah.
Yes. It went through 2 editions. It was reviewed not glowingly, but it was the first translation, the first full translation of the Commedia to be authored by a woman translator, which is a crucial achievement, and that opened up to like paved the way for other female translators to join in. With the first translation of the Convivio are by 2 women, one American, one English. And so it certainly is a crucial milestone. And yes, I'm very interested in your emphasis on translations as well, because we're not just collecting historical manuscripts in incunabula, but we're also looking at the English life, to say it with Guy Armstrong, the English life of Dante as well. So absolutely, thank you very much, Corinna. I think we'll have much more time to discuss this with everybody, but this comes very, very easily because I hand over to Christian, considering that the history of translation of Dante in America with Longfellow. So to you, Christian.
Good, thank you. Yeah, delighted to be part of this panel today and to revisit with Julianne, whom I have not met in person yet, at the Rylands Library, where I certainly have visited the collections, and Corinna, to meet you for the first time as well, having seen the books, I think, with Helen, and the visits at the at TCD, the Trinity College Library, there with Stephanie Breen and others. It's just wonderful to be connected in that way. And this whole Dante and Ireland thing is fascinating. I'm actually in a reading group right now, reading Joyce's Ulysses, and we were talking last week about Dante and Ulysses. So there's lots to do with Dante reception, which is actually more my angle. I'll kind of bring that in. I'm not going to show many, like really a couple of books maybe, but it'd be more about getting us to think about and leading a conversation about the meaning of collecting Dante and how that informs our other research that we do on the reception of Dante and are just thinking about Dante as a poet. I have my nice background here. So this is part of it. This is actually sort of part of our artworks inspired by Dante that we have in our collections. And we've seen this already with illustrated editions so beautifully here. And so it was mentioned that I'm the sort of secretary of the Dante Society. So I have the privilege of holding this John A. Jackson marble, of which there are actually 4 even in the Boston area here. John A. Jackson was a sculptor American who went to Florence. His daughter, Margaret Hastings Jackson, taught Dante and Italian literature at Wellesley College, and then gifted this marble to Ernest Hatch Wilkins, who was a former president of the Dante Society. And that's how things come along. On our call today, we have Alison Cornish, who's our president of the Dante Society. And so we can all feel very connected through our artworks here and our objects in our collections. And that's really the story that I think they were wanting to tell here in books, right? I see Christopher Kleinhans in the call, former editor of Dante Studies, and Cosette Bruns, who's worked with Justin Steinberg now on editing, copy editing, and preparing Dante Studies. So it's great to see these gatherings. Anyway, I'm going to improvise a little bit and show actually 2 little presentations here because Julianne, you showed in the Rylands Library that wonderful window, right, of the theologians and how Dante figures in that. We have some window stained glass in the Burns Library. So let me just show you very quickly that little presentation. And I'm going to share my screen out, and I need that one. And then I will blow that up. Sorry, I got a little bigger. And from the beginning. Okay, so I'm sitting just behind the tree, which is coming out of that very color right now. That's my office here in the Burns Library at Boston College. And then there's our doorway, and I knew I was coming to the right line. This is the 4th library I think I've managed. So anyway, looking up and interviewing, oh, look, there's Dante up there in the doorway. So I knew I'd come to the right library for this. Although at Burns Library, we really don't have Italian collections, but we, for whatever reason, the Jesuits who built Boston College were very inspired by Dante at the time. A little story to pick out some more. And there was stained glass commissioned for one of our rooms. This is just above my office here, the Thompson room, which we use for lectures. And at this end of the building, these windows represent epic poetry. And so right in the middle, we have appropriately here Homer and Virgil on the right, other Romance epics, and then right in the middle are the Dante windows. And then these are little snippets here that show you some of the wonderful stained glass and the parts of the Commedia that inspired them. So that's a little bit of where I am with you now. I hope I brought you in that space. Now, let me take you to some other libraries. And we're going to go first to the beginning. Okay, there we are. I'll follow slide to this. Some of you who have an interest in Dante and Dante bibliography will probably have run across this web exhibition at one time or another, Renaissance Dante in Print, which was originally a physical exhibition that was created between the University of Notre Dame and the Newberry Library in Chicago. And this goes back to 1993 and 94. And I'm sorry, this is gonna end up being a little bit of a personal narrative because this is how Dante changes your life, okay? So I was a graduate student in the Department of Theology at the time, and working on my exams and needed extra money, and worked as in the library as a graduate student. And this is at the very time that Ted Cacci, I'm sure most of everybody on the call here knows, when it came to Notre Dame as a professor in Italian. And this is also in the early 90s when material history really came into the theoretical thinking of humanistic studies, and very much with Ted here. So one of Ted's first questions, do you have any Dante in the library? And interestingly, we did, and nobody really knew about it because 100 years ago, or previously, this collection had been assembled by John Augustin Zahm, who was a priest of the Order of the Holy Cross, which is the founding order of the University of Notre Dame, and assembled this tremendous collection, and then it was sort of forgotten. And there it was right under our noses all the time. And so we took advantage of that opportunity to kind of study the history of that collection. That was my particular task in helping to put together this exhibition, was researching John Zahm and his Dante collecting. The other fun part of this was when the internet was literally being born. And we collaborated with the University of Chicago on textual databases project, the Opera del Vocabolario Italiano, but then also on mounting this exhibition on the web, which came out just as the exhibition was finishing up, I think, in the Newberry Library. We're talking 1993, 4, which is before Netscape was even a browser, just when the internet was literally being born. So I think this is probably the first rare book exhibit on the web. And that was one of the transformative things for me, realizing that scholarship could be engaged in libraries, material history, and then brought forward through the internet. And that was really exciting. And that's what I decided at that point to try to make my career in libraries as a library curator, and was hired at Notre Dame. And this has also led to the formation very directly of the Devers program in Dante studies, because the success of this exhibition enabled Ted and our department head, Luke Jordan, to advance a proposal through our university advancement for an endowment for a Dante Studies program. And Bill and Catherine Devers in Chicago put $1 million and then another $1 million a little later on. And that's really how the Dante Devers program in Dante Studies was born. So it's very exciting and drew me into that. I can also embarrass another person on the call here. I see Simone Marchesi has joined us today on your birthday of all days, Simone. There you go. And Simone is one of the first students who was brought from Italy to be part of it was really a master's program. So it was at Notre Dame by Ted. And so we got to know each other then. And I married his wife cousins, and there I am. So, and there's John Zahm in his office there at the University of Notre Dame in photo around 1903. And what's fun is I can zoom in on the photo and I can recognize certain of the books of Dante that are mixed in among the cabinets. And so I became quite fascinated with John Zahm, trying to figure out how he put together this collection of Dante books. And also not just the how questions, but why, why this little college out in the Midwest, there was really the Western frontiers there. I mean, why they were building a Dante collection. This is where John Zahm, much as he was an Americanist and in terms of his Catholic thinking and very much about the liberal American Catholic Church, was also very tied to the old world through his classical education.
Christian,
so,
could I interrupt you there for a second? Sorry, we're not actually seeing the second. We saw the first presentation, but the second presentation.
Oh, I'm not sharing this one out. Oh, sorry about that. Very good. I'm glad that somebody interrupted me, because I once did a talk one time, and I was supposed to be showing the slides of another speaker, and they never came online. So let me do that. There we go. Okay, good. So I'll run back. Now you're seeing it, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So this was the website that I was talking about, front page of Renaissance Dante in print. And there's John Zahm in his office. Okay. And next, I was going to turn about to the questions of how he assembled the collection. So where did he buy his books? What were the networks he used to do that? And the collections that he bought? And then also sort of the why of it became the question. So why at Notre Dame, this little Catholic university, in the middle west of the United States, kind of the western frontier at the time, at the end of the early 20th century, was trying to develop a Dante collection. So that's a whole nother story, maybe get into the discussion period, but it was precisely because the idea of a Catholic Dante post-unification Italy was coming back into play. So John Zahm being a procurator general for the order in Rome, precisely during the years when the Catholics were recapturing Dante for their own, okay? Fall into Risorgimento. That's what sparked Zom's interest. So one of the things that he managed to he acquired, among other sort of pamphlets and things about Dante, was this catalog here. This is a page of a catalog of a collection on Dante that was formed by Giulio Acquatici, a not so known person, not a scholar, a man of some actually fairly modest means, who became caught in the Dante mania at the end of the 19th century in Macerata, in this little medieval town of Crea, and he assembled this collection, just buying up the editions he could, like some of the other collectors will meet. And then he publishes this catalog, and Zom gets a copy of it. And this is marked up because Zom is intending to buy this collection, okay, which he did do. Now, it's interesting because that catalog didn't have any prices in it. It's not obvious. It looks more like a vanity published, here's my wonderful collection of Dante. But one has this theory that in fact, probably this collection was for sale. So that's where the archival research starts coming in. And so I go out and try to find other copies of this catalog. And sure enough, at the University of Michigan, they have one. And they sent me an image of it. And that's the one at the top here. And on the back of the thing, it has this little address line. So the Acquatici Dante collection to Monsignor, and then you find the name of a German bookseller. So clearly, Acquatici was selling his, it just confirmed that he was wanting to sell his collection. That's suspicion. And then the lower image there is actually from one of the inside covers of one of the volumes from the Acquatici Dante collection, where you see in his own hand the description that became part of his catalog and his little book label there. Okay, so the pride of the collector. There we are. Now, this is where the internet story comes in, okay, back in. So we published this exhibit on the web, and there's a little article there that tells the story of John Zom buying the Giulio Acquatici collection. He actually bought the Renaissance edition, and so had there were 40 some editions that are published between 1472 and 1629. And Acquatici had most all of them. He didn't have a Jesi Dante, he didn't have a Foligno, okay, but he had most everything else. And Zom acquired those, except like the ones he crossed out that he already had. Well, browsing the internet, Stefania Acquatici, okay, a granddaughter, finds this exhibition. We always wondered what happened. We heard this story of a Dante collection in our family and always wondered what happened to it. So there we go. So she writes me, I'm at Notre Dame, and within a year, this little medieval town plans a conference, okay, and invites me to come give a talk on it. So I expanded this whole thing into an article. But it just, the wonderful things that happen in life, through these stories and the way collections connect people. So here are all the Renaissance editions that Zom acquired from Acquatici, all laid out on his table together at the University of Notre Dame. So, so that story of John Zom really drew me into, again, working in libraries as a curator and this type of bibliographic research and archival research to understand the how and why of collections. So it became obvious, well, what are the other collections out there? We're going to actually go in reverse chronological order. We go from Zom, which is, he started in the late 1890s, 1900s period is when he was most collecting, okay, and active really kind of through the 20s. Now, backing up into the 1890s, we're going to meet Willard Fisk here, who was a collector in many fields, chess, which he loved to play, and then the Rhaeto-Romance language in the Engadine Valley. He was a linguist, so he collected there. And then Iceland, so he was very interested in Icelandic and Norse literature, and at Cornell University, where he gifted his collections and was professor at the time, gave what is still the most remarkable collection bibliographically on Icelandic culture. He gets caught up in Dante mania from a bibliographical challenge. He was not an Italianist, but there was maybe a personal passion. There was a woman who seemed to have been in love with very secretly. He was a man of very close passion, and he formed a whole Petrarch collection. And there's some wonderful letters there. But Dante was just sort of out there. Well, if you're going to be a great book collector, you have to collect Dante. And he was a bibliographer. And he said, well, precisely, Corinna, there's so many translations. Somebody needs to document and get control over this massive amount of Dante literature that particularly during the 19th century is being published. And the fascinating thing about Fisk is he built the largest Dante collection in the United States with never having actually seen most of the volumes. Okay? He was so skilled at book collecting that he worked his network of booksellers all across Europe. He got their catalogs, he ordered what he wanted, had it mailed directly in numbered parcels through a shipping agent, to Cornell University, and then hired a cataloger on the other end to make the catalog. It's fascinating work how he managed that. And what's in evidence here, this is the archival part, this is a scrapbook that the librarian George William Harris on the other end put together of all of Fisk's letters. So here are all the postcards. Here's another shipment coming, okay? It's, and I've literally, in my own media, transcribed most of this and actually figured out, how the collection is put together. So like Corinna, it's wonderful here, the 1790, when each volume was purchased at Julianne, the same thing, Julianne, it's really fascinating. So here's a list that of his Renaissance editions of the Divine Comedies and the ones that he had or he missed, and how he marked them up, and eventually the call numbers that were assigned to them in the library. And then just like Acquatici, book collectors like to design their book plates. So he's trying to work out with Harris here, the librarian, what the book plate will look like for the Biblioteca Dantesca. Acquatici had a Collezione Dantesca, a nice Dante collection. Fisk, it was Biblioteca, it was the library of Dante here that he works out over these couple of years. Okay, now we're going to back up still earlier in history. So one of the inspirations for Fisk to start building a Dante collection was Harvard University. And this is where we get back to Longfellow and the translation and the Dante Club. So in America, in the 19th century, how did you read Dante, right? Well, you have to have the books. These days we're so used to the internet that we get things electronically. We just assume things are plentiful. It's fairly easy even to buy rare books and certainly to obtain electronic text through the internet. If you're in New England and you want to read Dante and you want to read it in Italian and your name is George Tickner and you can read Italian and it's 1815, you have a very hard time getting an Italian edition. You have to work through London dealers and everything to do this. So this is where, as they wanted to read Dante, they needed to build a library. So scholars building a library, which they then decided to do through Harvard University, where they all had their employments and connections. And then Boston Public Library deals with the foundation of public libraries in the United States, one of the earlier major city municipal public libraries in the 1860s, building its own collection then of books and Dante. Okay, through Tickner's donation. So anyway, there's the catalog published in 1890. So Fisk used this in order to figure out the first 2,000 books to buy for his collection, which grew to 7,000. Okay, so they're marked up copies of this in the Fisk collection. Anyway, they're the triumvirate of Longfellow, whom we know as a translator. You may or may not know the names of Charles Eliot Norton, who was really the one who was the bibliographer behind this. He wrote his own commentary on Dante and really theorized about Dante along with James Russell Lowell, who's the third gentleman there, about Dante in America. And this is not the Catholic Dante. This is Dante as the poet of moral virtue, okay? Great New England Unitarian, okay? So it's very different. And then there's Fisk, who doesn't care about really either about the interpretation of Dante. It's just a great bibliographical chase, okay? So I think, yes, I've got a couple more slides here. This is just in Harvard, the other library story is, well, if you've got such a massive literature, how then does a library classify this? Now, most of us in our lifetimes are working with probably the Library of Congress, US Library of Congress systems, maybe some other national library systems. Certainly at Trinity College, you have quite a number of classification schemes. So when you start approaching a literature like Dante that's so vast, and there's not really established national standards for this, you start inventing your own classification schemes, which is very interesting simply to study for how do you organize, an author like Dante. Do you start with editions of the Divine Comedies? This is even where you get the idea of the minor works coming into play, or translations. Fascinating in its own right. Here's a photo of a library that no longer exists, Gore Hall. It's been replaced by Widener Library at Harvard University. This is their treasure room. There's a bust of Charles Eliot Norton. following his, the bust was put in, I think, just at the very last years of his life. That's a death funereal wreath. That's how we know it's in 1908. And again, like that John Zahm picture, you can zoom in and see a few Dante editions among other treasures there. So I'll stop with that and hope that sets up some further conversation among all of us as panelists.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks very much, Christian. This, like, you brought to our attention a number of incredibly interesting things. For instance, I'm thinking about the conflation between what Lowell actually called.
Dave, I told them what's going on.
Sorry. Yeah,
sorry.
No worries, Dai. Sorry. So what I was saying is that you brought to our attention also one crucial aspect of collecting Dante in 19th century, is the idea of the conflation between what Lowell called Dantophilia and Dantismo. So from amateur knowledge, amateur interest for Dante, as also an expression of kind of fashion, because let's admit that in 19th century Dante was a fashionable object for cultivated people, but at the same time Dantismo, so scholarly, growing scholarly professionalism and attention, which is also reflected in the range of titles that are produced throughout the 19th century and towards the end of the 19th century, where we have like the bulk production of scholarly texts, of editions, of commentaries, of handbooks, also for the growing studentship in Britain, Ireland, and the States. So that's one thing I'm very curious about. And if you would like to talk more about how these two, what could appear as opposing attitudes, actually are two sides of the same coin, and they are crucial, central to the development. Yeah, so yeah, I have.
No, that's the right words used, the Dantismo and the Dantophilia. That's really beautiful, what Federica said, because in fact, those spirits continue and they reinforce and help one another.
Exactly.
That's the thing that's so interesting and really beautiful in a way here. And tracing the history of the Dante Society, it was always about, and we kind of, this is our conscience today, need to always sort of prove ourselves in a way. And in fact, the bibliography project that we now collaborate on with the Società Dantesca Italiana is of that same spirit, going back to the foundation of the society to help create scholarly apparatus for the study of Dante. Okay, so that's the Dantismo aspect. There's less, as you're hearing, about still building the library collections, and it's great to see that, you know, with very focused purchases, exciting ones, you know, at Trinity, at the Rylands, that this continues. I know at the Notre Dame, they are continuing to, you know, there are some funds there through the Zahm endowment. Actually, he left some money that for a while wasn't being spent on Dante and now is, and then the Devers money to continue building collections of Dante. Okay, but the other story here is, of course, it's not just libraries buying book by book. Okay, it's libraries buying collections, and so collections are continue to be formed. And it's a shame. I think Simone ended up dropping off the call here for another thing, but this is a catalog of a collector that he knows well himself, Livio Ambrogia. Do other people on the call know about Livio Ambrogia's collection? Probably not. Okay, Julianne, you know something about this? You're smiling, so okay, because here, this one is for you. So Livio is an Italian businessman, and over the last, whatever, 30 years, assembled and then has proceeded to sell his collection of very rare and valuable editions of the Divine Comedy. One of the things, and that volumes, is this one here. Are you recognizing that one, Julia? No? Okay. Do you want to unmute there? I don't know if you want to comment or not. Maybe I'm putting a little on the spot. Okay, we don't know what to say. Are you unmuting now? Okay. So this
no, I guess I have a feeling I know what that is. Yes.
Sorry?
I have a feeling I know what that is. Yeah.
You know what that is, right? Right. So we've seen this, another copy of this, Corinna showed us, of the Aldus 1502 Dante. Okay. This one is not so beautifully illustrated around, but it's a very important one. It was actually printed on vellum, one of the very few copies on vellum that was done. And it used to belong to which library, Julianne?
So it used to belong to the Rylands Library.
Oh, it used to belong to the Rylands. It doesn't make your heart hurt to see it.
Yeah, it does.
It does, you know, and this is unfortunately one I know that you just couldn't buy back either, right? And this is when earlier in the library's history, just before it started, you know, building the collections again, had to sell some of the collections, or they thought they had to sell.
Earlier, 1988.
1988 here, right? 1980 is when this was sold in then. Okay, right. Yeah, and just before the sort of revival. So anyway, it's out there again. The book survives, and I don't know, maybe it can come back in some way or shape or form. I'm not sure where it is now. If it's still with Livia or not. But anyway, a little bit of a story there.
I was thinking now that you were mentioning the Dante Society, so of course the Dante Society of America and the Società Dantesca Italiana. I'm thinking about the crucial connection that exists between the collections and the societies, the Dante societies that were born during the late 19th century. And what I'm thinking is also that the Rylands collection was central to the activities of the Manchester Dante Society, and perhaps Steve wants to comment on this as well. But it was central, and also because for in Eric Hitler's view of the collection and of the library was to put the books and the collected items into the hands of the readers. So very early on in the 20th century, an exhibit was organized by the librarian, but also by Guppy and the Rylands librarian, but also like they were encouraging scholars and members of the Dante Society, the Manchester Dante Society, to make use of the items that she had acquired and she was acquiring and were acquired by the library. So it's very important to always consider how the origin of the scholarly traditions are rooted also in these collections and vice versa. So I don't know. Sorry, Stephen. I just mentioned you about.
No, not at all. You know as much about it as I do, Federica, probably. But I mean, I think it's really interesting from the point of view of these reception contexts, both of kind of where these collections are being bought from, how they're making that translation, and then how they're utilised on arrival. And I think, you know, what I find particularly stimulating about the Manchester kind of reception context of this, you know, the angry poet in the new industrial Cottonopolis of, you know, a poet who describes aspects of the Inferno, which gives a poetic language to an urban experience which didn't have its own language because it didn't have the experience of urbanization. So it kind of goes to the best poetic language. And I think that's part of the reason that there's this kind of industrial reception of Dante. And we're going to be doing an event with the Rylands on the 10th of June, if anybody's interested, on industrial Dante, looking precisely at this and at the origins of the Manchester Dante Society. And Mrs. Rylands was one of the kind of initial presidents of the Manchester Dante Society that was formed in 1906. And they had a very active program of events and of lectures. And Warren Vernon gave the inaugural lecture, who obviously was the son of the Vernon, who also had links with Manchester, Vernon Park in Stockport, around the corner from my house, and produced the kind of first printed editions in parallel of the incunable edition we've been talking about and looking at. So I think these, you know, I'm really interested in the way in which Mrs. Rylands was in competition with Bell Green at the Morgan in buying collections around that period. And the kind of the industrial magnates of the north of England tend to get sort of slightly overlooked, and we just jump to Pierpont Morgan and we jump to the kind of Harvard collections and the Fisks. But there was this kind of industrial pre-American period, if you like. And I think it's fascinating, for example, Richard Bennett, who is not much known about, rather eccentric industrial bleacher from Bolton, but he purchased William Morris's collection wholesale auction, and that was one of the foundation collections for the Morgan collection in New York. So it kind of went through the hands of an industrial bleacher from Greater Manchester before finding its way to New York. And so these translation histories, I think, are incredibly telling. And Mrs. Rylance is particularly interested because she was a rabid Congregationalist, very anti-Catholic, very pro the Risorgimento and Italian independence. But she was co-chair of the Manchester Dante Society with the Bishop of Salford, who was an Iranologist who'd trained in the University of Louvain and was writing papers on Dante and Persia in 1908. I mean, talk about post-colonialism. He was doing it over 110 years ago. So they're fascinating stories of these translations, both in the point of view of how were they exported. So, you know, I'm interested in the relationship between Olszki as a kind of wholesale book exporter to the US, but also to the UK, and then looking at the relationships between Olszki, his catalogues, and how the reception context in America and how these were actually traded. So I think there's more work to do on this.
Sì, c'è sole.
Certainly.
Sabato piove da dopo mezzogiorno, cioè la seconda parte del giorno.
I think your mic is off, is on. But yeah, no, absolutely, Steve. It's absolutely it's a very important way of approaching like studying the collections, like trying to trace the history of these collections, which are there and we constantly use and we regularly use, but we don't really interrogate how they came to be, how they came to be used, how they were first used and then like developed, changed in the practice, like changed the practices of reading Dante in the UK, of popularizing Dante. So we were mentioning lectures and everything. So considering how the exactly the outreach program that these libraries had early on as well. So like with Trinity, we have the teaching, the institutionalized teaching, but with Manchester, we have the extramural one. So we have a different dimension. And also what I'm thinking, and perhaps I am, you want to join in, people want to join in this, is also reflecting about the commodification of Dante in this period in modern times, so from the 19th century onwards. Fisk's attitude speaks a lot of a very learned, high-hand collectionism, yes, but also like the perception of the material value of the items acquired, of the commodification of it, of the reproduction and multiplication of, because one thing we don't really realize is that the 19th century saw a boom of publications, of Dante-related publications, like of course because of the Risorgimento and the changes also in the industrial production of the book. So perhaps anybody wants to join in into this, but Fisk's attitude to it was very, very interesting. I was noticing that the ticks and everything speaks volumes about the attitude of the collector, Dante. Enrique Rylance hasn't left us much to look at in this sense, perhaps, but I'm sure I will have to study more about it, but Fisk is certainly interesting.
Well, I think maybe a comment to make here, Federica, is something that every book tells a story about itself and its own production. And that's where, going back to, I referred to its material history consciousness that enters humanistic studies in the 90s and really carries through and becomes more sophisticated. So book history, as a discipline, and all the skills that one learns, and bibliographically to understand printing and paper making and the rest, all these things have been, I think, really brought more into humanistic scholarship now, and with great benefit and effect. So you can say more intelligent things, and be kept from saying things that are not so intelligent at times. That the more one knows there. I think this is where the idea of librarians, archivists, scholars working together. And thinking of the Ryland Julianne showed us the Amos Natini illustrations, right, that were done and conceived earlier in the 20th century, but they were only printed during the era of fascism in these giant monumental volumes, okay? So, there's another example of just looking at the thing, but really looking at it just helps you to figure out what's going on. and that social dimension, Stephen, it's really, thinking about Manchester, you say that the industrial Dante, this is brilliant, but I think there's a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I was also thinking about the second to last edition that you showed, no, the last edition that showed us, Corinna, with the new illustrations. That speaks of the continued interest that Trinity has in developing in developing its collection and bringing in new material, new illustrated editions of the text, which, like, in terms of reception, they're still going through the process of monumentalization in a sense. Like, they're not, like, the artistic and cultural value is not fixed already, is being fixed, and the collectionism has as part of it, is part of it, certainly, I imagine.
And if I may say, we also have, and it's not a book, but we have all the lithographs of the Inferno for each canto by Liam O'Brien. And the Dante Centre has, got it on the website and all 100, but he donated them to the college. And I'm hoping that for September, the death of Dante, the 700 years, that we shall do something online. It's not realistic to do it in person, but we do something online where we will bring in Liam's lithographs, seeing that the college possesses them, that he donated them, of the whole Inferno. And they do appear every now and again in the building where Italian is taught, and they're exhibited. I mean, they appear in that sense. We can't have all 33 together. But so it's also not just the book, but there is the illustration as it exists with an adjunct, because he's very different from Monica Beisner. Liam is an interpreter. She's more of an illustrator. And so the contrast, is very interesting. And I use both of them, both artists, for my teaching, because it's very helpful for students to get the visual element which adds to the canto, and not just the text there, for them to understand that it's text and image, that you can create something beyond, and I think that's very important. So
can I just ask you before I hand over to Dara's raised hand, can I ask you, have you noticed a different kind of response with the two illustrations in your students?
Oh yes, I mean, I've had even a student who has gone on and done a master's dissertation in history of art on Liam's work and Rauschenberg, and she has wanted some, and she has interviewed Liam and worked and had discussions with him, and that has been very helpful to her for what she has written for her degree. And now she has got a job in Milan in a completely different area, but it's just lovely. It's all part of what one does. Teaching is the best. I feel you're sharing all the time, and you are bringing something, you're bringing light, and more then comes from what you do. And it's lovely, but it's very real to have the visual dimension. I think it matters. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dara, you had a question, perhaps?
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much, Federica, and thank you to our three speakers. That was really fascinating. And I didn't think coming into this today that I would actually suffer from window envy, but that they really are something else. My question really is to all three of you, and it's really about the future of you all allude to it in some kind of way. And I think, Kristen, when you were kind of showing how the Rylands had to sell that particular edition back in 1988, and you think of what's going on in Britain in 1988 with the Thatcher years. And I suppose my question is really about what are the challenges, what are the few, like when we come to the 800th centenary of Dante in 100 years time, what are Dante collections going to be like? And are we talking about a very kind of restricted kind of group of centers? Is you have the kind of digital challenge that's facing us as well. So I just really I want to ask you, just kind of think forward. I mean, where are we going with Dante? What are the kind of Dante futures in the context of archives, in the context of collections?
I'm happy to speak, but other than that, go ahead. No?
Yeah.
Yes.
I have some thoughts, but I don't, you know, to defer, I've spoken a lot already. Okay, I'll go ahead. So I think it can move in a couple of different directions, in the sense that to the extent that if to take Federica's idea of the Dantismo versus Dantophilia, okay? So what does Dante studies, or Italian studies more broadly, humanistic studies, need in terms of scholarly work on Dante? And how is that going to be published and disseminated? And increasingly, that is moving electronic. So that's where the role of the individual library, and much less the personal collector, is not so involved anymore, right? It's the publishers and their online databases and everything take care of that. Libraries, be part of that ecosystem. We need to license those and support them and make them available to scholars. So scholarship on Dante is not going to be so much of a collectible thing so much anymore. But it's quite interesting, and this anniversary year is a great illustration of that, of publications where, because they're the interest in illustration, or making the new translation and making it in a certain edition and dedicated in a certain way, you know, print is not, by no means dead, right? So I think we're going to see more. And it's interesting for a curator's challenge, is you often find people who are doing very expensive sort of fine press editions and begging libraries to buy them. Oh, you have a Dante collection, you should spend thousands of dollars buying this thing, okay? Well, some of them are very fine, right? that deserve to be in libraries. Others are not, you know, but, you know, should they be collected as sort of evidence of this Dantophilia, you know, that happens? So yes, I think there's a place for that kind of collecting. But one has to, that's where the curators come. You can't quite do everything. I think collecting Dante more internationally, these obscure, you know, receptions in different areas, and the more the street literature sort of things, you know, programs, you know, the Manchester Dante Society. Well, hopefully they've been saved in the archives, but maybe not. You know, other kinds of ephemera things could really be collected well. I think some of us are familiar with the online project Dante Today, right? Sightings, C-I-T-I-N-G, and sightings, you know, that Ariel Cyber and Elizabeth, you know, Beth Coggeshall curate. So that's a curated online collection of Dante ephemera out there. So I think that's another type of, and this leads into digital. I think you were kind of wondering about it earlier. So digital creation and digital collecting of Dante, we have to figure out kind of how to do that. It will happen organically, but we can be intentional about it too, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. I would just hope that the Dante Centre that has been set up so brilliantly in Cork, I'm just hoping that the interest in Dante is there. The fact that Liam O'Brien can do all 100 lithographs of stimulated by the Commedia, I think somehow that is going to continue, and the local interest will be very strong. But for COVID, Liam's 100 lithographs would now be exhibited in Dublin Castle, which is a must for all visitors to Dublin. And, you know, this very wonderful exhibition was planned, which hasn't been able to go ahead. And I think libraries will just find in some manner funding to keep acquiring, because although, yes, we have the digital medium, etc., at the same time, what the library has in terms of the tangible book, I see somehow lasting long ahead. I want to, or maybe it's that I want to believe that, you know, but that is just perhaps a hope and no more. But I feel, as we have in the library, the 1472 Foligno Dante, that we shall continue. We won't let go. We won't let go.
Question or a comment? Anytime we have a Dante year or a Boccaccio year or a Petrarch year, the number of publications seems to grow exponentially. It was fairly low up until 1965, and now we're at 2021. I'm not sure what it's going to be at 2065 or at 2121, which of course would be a very numerologically nice year, sort of the symmetry of it and all. But I do worry about the amount of money that is going to have to be found by libraries that are already experiencing dramatic cuts and always increases in prices for the license to have certain digital repositories and so on. So I think we're dealing here with not only an explosion and a great enrichment of Dante studies that will continue, but I do worry about the very practical means that we have to be able to purchase and to have available in enough libraries so that things will continue to, that our students, our researchers and so on will continue to have the materials available for them. That's my comment, and there's no answer to it. I have no answer.
Well, there is the answer. We've been talking about already, Kristen, is that think of, here's a metaphor that suddenly comes to mind, that libraries are like the sedimentary beds of rivers. Okay? So there's just water moving through. That's a great document. So, you know, people are producing books, there's scholarship, there may be artistic books. If you're going to create something, that takes an investment already on the part of a publisher. The creator, the publisher, there's a Kickstarter campaign going for a modern manuscript of the Dante's, you know, of George Cochrane's manuscript. I think you're talking about it. Is that part of this series or another? I get some of the series mixed up.
I was going to mention this at the very end.
There we are. Good. Okay. So you
wait till the very end, and then I'll
right to the very end. But so the idea is that there's capital that's creating these things. Okay. And then there are collectors. So it's unfortunate that the Rylands, you know, decided, but you have a collector, at least somebody who cared about Dante, who bought that volume. Now, hopefully it can go on to somebody else. And so at times libraries do purchase things, Chris, but other times there are donations that happen, right? Or benefactors. I mean, the whole Rylands Library is set up by Enrique and Rylands, right? So there's hope, you know, that people just care. That's the main thing. If you care enough to create something, and then there are others who care about it through another cycle of its life, and then there are libraries who become the curators that take it in. So I don't worry too much in that way. And this is where sometimes the chasing of the ephemera becomes important, or multiple copies. Again, the little story of finding that copy of Acquatici's catalog sent to a bookseller suddenly opened up with primary evidence that the other copy didn't have. So, you know, it's sort of endless as to what can be collected. And that's where scholars can help guide us to what is the evidence that's worth libraries acquiring these days. Maybe a way to kind of put it to help focus our resources, Chris, rather than despairing that we can't collect everything, because we can't. You know, getting this idea and working with scholars to figure out what should libraries be collecting, whether it's in Dante studies or other disciplines. So we're doing a meaningful, you know, application of our resources to acquisition, and then the dissemination, digitization of the big prospect, all those things, the economies that go around it.
Those are very good points, Christian. I appreciate them. Yes.
Yeah, and I also think about the digital projects that exist. So the digital Dante at the Rylands, like Guy Armstrong's project, is certainly central to changing, to making the collections still relevant, still usable. So even from a distance, like giving. Perhaps Julianne wants to say something about this, but yes. So in like widening the scope and widening the reach of the collections from a distance, from a digital perspective. Now, in times of COVID, we are all grateful for these tools as well, because they keep the research going, they keep the work going, and they open new pathways into it. So absolutely. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about your experience with that as well.
I could just point out, I put in the chat the link to the small number of digital editions that we've published a few weeks ago. But we are, in fact, Guy has just submitted her application today. She sent an email just before the meeting started to say it's in. And the intention there will be to actually digitize all our 15th, 16th and 17th century editions and make them available.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
If we get the funding. So.
We'll keep all our fingers crossed. Okay.
Yeah, can I just ask one thing before you wrap up there, Federica? And I don't know if Steve is still here, I can't see, but this industrial Dante, is there more information on that that could be shared?
Yeah, I'll put it. It's on the 10th of June. I think it's going to be at 7 o'clock in the evening. It's a collaborative event by the John Rylance kind of public outreach people, and it'll be me, a research assistant who's been working on the archive of the Manchester Dante Society, who's over in Rome at the moment, and somebody from the Manchester Art Gallery who'll be looking at some of the Dante pictures that were donated, one of them by a member of the Manchester Dante Society, with the kind of pre-Raphaelite holdings that we have. So we're trying to kind of not close the circle, but give a kind of really broad-based account of the kind of reception context that was industrial Manchester in the 19th century, and quite, you know, what was it about this collection of seemingly people who shouldn't be in the same room at the same time, but who came together as enthusiasts of Dante, and what was their activities and what did they get up to? And yeah, just looking at Manchester as a reception context, and how Manchester took the model of the Società Dantesca in Florence, actually, for setting up their own society. And they're also responsible for endowing my chair, for which I'm eternally grateful. The Serena chair at Manchester should become the Serena Dante chair, because 50% of the money was raised by the citizens of Manchester to augment the endowment that came from Arturo Serena, after having been left out when Oxford and Cambridge and Birmingham got offered chairs. So Manchester wrote demanding from the members of the Dante Society they also had a Serena chair of Italian at the University of Manchester.
A wonderful example of northern chippiness.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a very chippy Dante, as you will see. I think it is it's very different from the Oxford Dante. It's very different from the London Dante. And one thing that we'll be focusing on in the talk is how Manchester celebrated the 600th anniversary in 1921, when they launched a public appeal, raised money for the restoration of Dante's tomb. So there's actually a plaque in the church next to Dante's tomb, thanking the Manchester Dante Society for its contribution to the restoration, which is I went to see when I was at the Boccaccio Fest, actually, Christopher Kleinhans mentioned, back in whenever it was, 2013. I made a trip to the church during the lunch break at that conference to go and check out the Manchester Dante Society plaque in the church. So they're really interesting stories, and I think they throw up these threads, and it's, as much as it's about increasing the size of the collection, or how comprehensive collections are, it's also about taking up these threads, and actually libraries and archives finding out more about their holdings and digging deeper into them, in a sense, in terms of their provenance histories and their social context of the acquisitions. So yeah, it's the 10th of June, 7 o'clock in the evening, and I'll send around a link that can be distributed if people are interested.
Fantastic. So I think we can now wrap up. I just want to thank wholeheartedly our speakers today, because the event was beyond expectations, really. I really much enjoyed all your flash presentations, and I hope we can keep the conversation going, because I think there is much to be said about collecting Dante, about working with archives and libraries, and broadening like our view, our understanding what it means to study Dante in this context and in this day and age between analog and digital. And before our goodbyes, I hand over to Dara to talk about our next event.
Okay, thank you, Federica, and thank you to our wonderful speakers. That was really fascinating. So our spring series of Dante Dialogues is going to come to an end on May the 21st at 6 p.m. Friday, May the 21st. And that is going to be, so if today was collecting Dante, our final one, I think quite suitably, is going to be illustrating Dante. And it's illustrating Dante, manuscripts, medieval and modern. And our guests that day are going to be Melissa Conway. Anyone who follows Melissa on Twitter, for example, every day she posts these wonderful images of the Dante manuscripts that she's looking at, and this is going to be fascinating. And especially also we would have George Corcoran, who everyone's talking about at the moment for having produced this modern manuscript, which has got this wonderful Kickstarter campaign. I see a mention of it was made in the chat earlier on. So we're going to have the two of them talking about their from two very, very different perspectives, and David Bowe is going to be mediating that one. So that's going to be May the 21st, Federica.
Good. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Dara, for organizing this, and thank you.
And thank you to Federica for quite brilliantly putting it all together. Thanks, Federica.
For joining us.
Lovely. Everyone's contribution. Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.